It's wonderful to be here. I'm so thrilled to see all of you. I'm so thrilled to be launching the second book in what's now going to be a trilogy, God willing, if I live long enough. Yeah, it's wonderful to be launching it here in my hometown, where most of it takes place, or at least in the area, with all of you guys. So there's no place I would launch these books other than right up here in Lake of the Woods in Baudette. Thanks for coming. Thank you all. And thank you. Hi, Mary. Oh my God, I'm seeing all these people. And my friend Jody, who came all the way up from the cities. I can't believe it. I was my old workmate. Anyway, hey, Jody. So, anyway, here we are. So the last book, Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, came out in 2011. And why has it taken me so long to write a sequel? Well, two things. First of all, I didn't really think I was going to write a sequel. I thought that, you know, I'd written a book and the characters are pretty well wrapped up and, you know, I could just leave them alone. People kept asking for one, and especially Lorraine, I think is not here today, but she was just insistent. She said, you gotta write another book. And I tried, actually. I felt like I was done with these characters, but I tried writing a couple mystery novels, because, you know, I worked in criminal law, and as Jody knows, we worked together. So I had lots of stories, and I thought, I can do this. And I wrote a couple. I mean, I started to write a couple, but I always stopped, you know, and I just kind of lost interest. And so finally, characters started calling to me again, and the place more than anything, because I might have lived most of my life now away from Lake of the Woods County, but Lake of the Woods County has never left me. And I just, you know, I dream about it, and it's in my books. It's just where I go. So I was at a reading in St. Cloud at some point after the first book came out, and a woman there asked me if I was going to do a sequel. And I said, I don't think so. I think, you know, I'm satisfied with things the way they are. And she said, well, why don't you write a novel about some of the secondary characters, the minor characters, the ones who are kind of in the background? And I said, boy, that's a good idea. And so, in 2018, finally, after I retired, I started writing that book. And the characters that you'll see in this book in Muskeg are Hazel and Minnie, who were the couple that had raised Rose in the first book, if you recall. Ran an island at Oak Island, or ran a resort rather. Little Roy, who was the drunken mute fiddler that played at Faunce all the time and had to be propped up against the wall so he could keep going. And so that they figure big in this book. And I also brought back Sadie because she's kind of a larger-than-life character, and Magnus, and Joe Baudette, who in my book is kind of the town fortune teller. I even took a year-long novel class because I needed somebody to kick me in the butt and make me finish this novel, and that's what I did. And then I reorganized it. So the way it goes is that Hazel, part of the book takes place in the 20s, because Hazel, who is in her 40s by the time we see her in Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, came from Savannah, Georgia, and so I gave her a backstory that goes between 1922 and 1925. And the rest of the book then catches up, and it's in 1937, which is a year after the relocation, when there are only a few people still hanging on out at Faunce, which I call, just to fictionalize a little, Faunce Ridge. And those people are Little Roy the fiddler, Marie, who's a new character, and the Dupree family, which is actually the Doll family in disguise, because I know they hang on forever. And I don't talk much about them, I just thought I'd give them a little shout out in the book. So in any event, this is it's a love story, an adventure story. It's got some suspense, and definitely some Northwoods magic, like the first one did. So, I first had to figure out, am I talking too loud? This thing is echoey. Okay, all right. All right, Lindsay says she uses it the most, so I know she has to talk to a big audience. So I had to figure out how Hazel got from Savannah, Georgia, all the way up to Oak Island running a resort with Minnie. Well, what was she doing? Hazel, when we started the book in 1922, women had just gotten the right to vote 2 years before, and it's Prohibition. She's platonically married to Milt. They're both gay. And, you know, being gay is not easy today, but it was really not easy back in the 20s. So if you could be institutionalized as a deviant, or, you know, or worse, right? So she and Milt are kind of each other's protection. They're best friends. But Hazel meets Theda, who's a beautiful young woman. They're both young, reckless, and from a wealthy family. And one night, 4th of July, 1922, they go to an all-woman speakeasy in Savannah, which I made up. I have no idea if there was one, but there might have been one, right? And the police raid it. And they're arrested. And so the first part I'm going to read you from the book is when they appear along with a lot of other women in front of the court. So everybody can hear me okay, right? All right. The next day, God, I feel echoey. All right. The next day, maybe the day after, the cell door opened, and she and the other women moved together like a long, slow centipede down a hallway. Do you want me to give? Do you want the page number? It's page 6. Hazel heard their feet shh, 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 as they lurched up to another hallway she prayed was the last. No one talked except the guards, who nudged them along. Come on now, don't be dragging your feet, ain't got all day. The words blurred with the shuffling feet. Where was Theda? Had they taken her away? People lined the hall, but she couldn't tell who they were and didn't care to look. Cameras like giant eyes pointed at them. Got something to say? Look over here. Vultures, someone behind her hissed. Hazel turned to see Theda, dress torn, nose swollen, eye purple and black. So they got a little beating in the process of being arrested. They squeezed hands and moved with the others toward wide doors that swung open into a large courtroom. Every seat was full, but it didn't matter because they were not going to be sitting down. The guards pushed them to the front, where a judge with white hair and a dusty black robe sat up on a dais, like a preacher, Hazel thought, with a very large pulpit. Bailiff, read the charges, he said. A man in what looked like another police uniform stepped forward with a big sheet of paper. Imbibing in an illegal establishment, disturbing the peace. Anything else, the judge asked? Battery of a policeman, 2 counts. He frowned. Let's hear those first. Read the names of the accused. Theda Alexander and Hazel Goodman. Step to the front, the judge said, scowling down at them. Those are serious crimes. What kind of girls are you? Laughter rippled through the room. He banged his gavel. Bail in the amount of $300 apiece. Hazel gasped. She and Milt could never come up with that kind of money. He leaned over the bench. You're lucky. If you were men, I'd be holding you without bail. All right, he continued. Everybody else up here, you heard the charges. Disturbing the peace, imbibing an illegal house. Guess real ladies are a thing of the past. You're coming back to this courtroom a week from today. $50 on each of you. He turned to Hazel and Theda. That means $700 for you two, $350 each. And you better have a lawyer when you come back. You're going to need one. All right. So then we move on. So what happens, I'm outlining a little, I won't give away all the stuff for you, but is that Theda's family is very wealthy, and the court system in Savannah is corrupt, and they cut a deal with the prosecutor and with the judge. And what the deal involves is that all the charges against Hazel and Theda, who kind of got mixed it up with the police, are dropped in exchange for Hazel's moving out of town permanently. So it's like, get out of town, you're good. They bought her a one-way ticket to the most northern city they could think of, which was Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hazel's a cook. She's a fabulous cook, and she ran a diner down in Savannah. And so she goes looking for a cooking job, and she has heard through the grapevine about this guy called Magnus. This is before he moves up to Lake of the Woods, who runs a speakeasy on the Mississippi River called the Merry Widow. And so she finds it, and this is about how she finds the speakeasy and finds him. The next day, Hazel set off for the Merry Widow speakeasy. She knew better than to ask anyone at the Women's Hotel how to get there. She doubted they'd consider working there suitable for a woman. Mildred said it was near the Mississippi River, which she could scarcely believe was all the way up here in the north. She put on a dress, a hat, and good walking shoes. First, she retraced her steps to the Milwaukee Depot on Washington Avenue, then walked north. There were very few buildings on the side of the street closest to the river, mainly trees, brush, and a few ramshackle dwellings. She decided to explore a footpath that snaked just below, dipping and rising with the contour of the bank. She'd always liked to walk, and the breeze from the river ruffled her hair and helped distract her from all she had just left. She couldn't just curl up into a ball of misery. First, she had to get a job, settle in, catch up on her sleep. There'd be plenty of time later to cry and be sad. Up ahead, just at the edge of the riverbank, she noticed a building partly dug into the hillside. Like a cave, she thought. These northerners. No windows that she could see, and all covered with vines like the speakeasy in Savannah. She smelled frying food, approached the place, and looked for a door. Nothing obvious, but footprints on one side of the structure, and when she got closer, she saw a peephole and knocked. No answer at first, then a male voice said, "Yeah? I'm looking for Magnus," she said. "Is he here? Who wants to know?" "Hazel Goodman," she replied, feeling silly, then pathetic. "From Savannah, Georgia. I'm looking for work as a cook." A door swung open, and a tall, husky man with tousled dark hair and stubble on his chin stood in front of her. "Well, why didn't you say so right off the bat?" he said, in a voice that seemed to echo out of his barreled chest, covered in a half-open shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He swiped an arm across his ruddy face, shining with sweat. "Sorry," he said, and stepped outside, letting the door close behind him. "So hot in there," he said. "My cook up and left in July. Can't say I blame him. I probably would have quit too. In the winter it's cozy with a kitchen, no windows, but in the summer it's pure hell. Nobody wants to cook in my place once summer comes." He put out a large hand. "Magnus Giles," he said. "Pleased to meet you. Hazel Goodman from Savannah." For the moment, Hazel couldn't think of anything to say. "You sure you want to work in this hellhole? I mean the heat, not the place itself." But then again, you're from the South. You're probably used to it," Magnus went on. "None of my people could take it today. So I went down to the river and brought back a whole mess of catfish. You think you can cook them?" Hazel couldn't help but laugh. "Mr. Giles, call me Magnus for Christ's sake. Only the cops use my last name." "I reckon I can cook pretty much anything," she said. "You just show me this catfish." "Be my guest." Magnus opened the door for her. "Can we leave it open?" she said. "That's how we cool off our kitchens in Georgia." Thus began Hazel's career at the Merry Widow. So time goes on, and Magnus brings the entire crew of the Merry Widow up to Oak Island for a vacation, because they worked hard, and that's where she meets Minnie, and a very young Rose who's like a child, falls in love with the place, falls in love with them, and feels incredibly peaceful, because, she's had a very hard time. And eventually goes back for vacation all by herself. And although she hadn't planned to, ends up staying there. She stays for a month. And finally she writes a letter to Magnus and her people in Savannah, including Theda, who by now has been married off to a wealthy guy and had a child. And just tells him she's going to stay. She's never felt better in her life, and she's going to stay there. And she and Minnie become a couple, and they raise Rose, and that continues in the second book, or the first book, but anyway, we're doing the pre-story now. So, one day in 1937, we jumped ahead several years, she's sitting on the dock at this resort I dreamed up in Oak Island, and she sees a boat coming in, the mail boat, and somebody on deck is waving like crazy to her, and she can't figure out who it is. And it turns out it's Theda. Theda has escaped her husband, and who's trying to put her into a hospital and take their child, who's a boy, Teddy, 12 years old. And she took her car, left Savannah, and drove all the way up to Minnesota, and is now is about to set foot on the island. She's never met Minnie, and Hazel is excited and scared and all kinds of things. But eventually, they get wind that Albert has hired detectives and he's coming up to look for them. And so she turns to Sadie to protect Theda and ward these guys off. Because eventually Albert, that's the husband, and the two detectives who he's hired come to town, and they stay at Sadie's place. They're not at Oak Island. And Sadie and Francois seize on a way to kind of put them out of commission. And here's how it works. There's a dance going on at the Hotel Pascal. Back in the kitchen, the baked plum scent filled the room, cut with something she couldn't put her finger on. Francois sat at the table with a cup of coffee. "Aren't you going to have some?" Sadie asked. He shook his head. "Maybe tomorrow. For now, I pay attention." She felt a tickle of alarm. "Wait, you made 2 cakes, right? One for us and one for them." "Yes," he said, with a rare smile that made his green eyes glow. "And we enjoy it, but they enjoy it more." Sadie sat down and savored the plum cake and just whipped cream. She murmured. She was not one to go crazy over food, but this was special, even for Francois, who was a magician in the kitchen. It was tender, just sweet enough, and a little tart. Then she heard the bark of male laughter. She got up and pushed the swinging door. Hard-faced Cal, he's a nastier one than 2 detectives, sprawled in his chair, laughing like a crazy man. Gus had his head down, doing the same thing, except not so loud. His back shook and his fist pounded the table like he just heard a really good joke and couldn't quite believe it. Albert watched them. "Ain't that something?" he said. "I've known these fellows a long time. They never relax. They're little tin soldiers. Bless their hearts, they need to relax a little, have some fun now and then." Was this the same Albert that had walked into her hotel? "Well, they sure are doing that," Sadie replied. "Can I get you all anything?" "More of that cake, the best thing I ever had." "Coming up," she said. "You staying the night, I'm guessing?" Albert nodded. "Room for me and one with twin beds for the boys here." "Well, come on over to the desk and we'll take care of it," Sadie said. He strolled after her, swaying to the music. "How much?" she asked as he filled out the guest book. $2.50 for your room." Sadie upped the price by 50 cents, and $3 for the double. He surprised her by paying without argument. Rich people usually want to talk you down. She handed him the keys. "Be right back with more cake and coffee." The men demolished their second helpings. Gus and Cal somehow managed to stop laughing long enough to eat every crumb, and Gus even picked up the bowl and licked it. Sadie tried not to laugh. Now, said Albert. "Manners." But he didn't sound upset. His eyes closed halfway and his head dipped. Eventually, he'd start awake, but it took longer and longer each time. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Look at my time. 1:55, okay. So Albert gets settled into his room, and Gus and Cal, the 2 tough detectives, are still there. And by this time, they're passed out the table, or just about. So Sadie asked Francois, "What do we do with Gus and Cal?" Francois looked thoughtful. "They should go far away, where they know nobody and nobody knows them, where Albert does not think to look." "The bottom of the river," Sadie said. She was only half joking. But the problem with making people disappear that way was that sooner or later, someone came looking for them, at least most of the time. Francois shook his head. "No, they must go farther, much farther. Perhaps they would like to take a trip on the train." "What are you talking about?" Sadie said. The Canadian National Passenger train that dipped into Lake of the Woods on its way to Manitoba had come through earlier in the afternoon. "Many people, they ride the rails now," Francois said. "Maybe these boys also." Sadie chuckled. "I'll get the car." It wasn't that hard to transfer Gus and Hal to the back seat. They were loose-bodied and still laughing, but growing quieter. As Francois guided them, one arm over the shoulder of each, he began to sing a French lullaby. He's French-Canadian. The notes melted into the darkness as they bundled the men into the soft upholstery. Sadie had packed up the rest of the plum cake made especially for them. "What now?" she said, sliding behind the wheel. Now, Francois replied, we wait for them to sleep. What if they don't? He showed her a thermos. I have some of what Joe gave you and made a tea. We have them drink now. Warm them up. Sadie got out of the car and opened the back door. Boys, she said, have something hot. It's cool out here. Gus and Cal slumped together, giggling, eyes half closed. She held the cup to their lips, first one, then the other. Drink, just a little. That's it. It smelled like licorice. Nothing like the dried green leaves Joe had given her. Maybe the stuff really was magic. They waited. The two men leaned against a seat. Soon they were snoring. It was past midnight, and the Baudette streets were empty of people. Sadie turned onto Main and drove the few blocks to the depot. No, said Francois, the station, she is too public. There are lights. So she took a right just before the depot, drove a few blocks, and turned again. So they were next to the tracks, but protected by darkness and trees. I hope you got a good plan, she said, turning off the car. I do, Francois said, humming the lullaby again. Gus and Cal remained sound asleep. Sadie covered them with her coats. She wanted to go far away, but they might as well be warm on the journey. That way, too, they were less likely to wake up. Finally, Francois said, now we take them out. They carried first Cal, then Gus, and laid them beside the tracks. Jesus, God, they're heavy, Sadie said. She removed their guns. Cal also had brass knuckles and a blackjack. She took them too. SOBs sure came prepared. Sadie heard the whistle, then saw the white light of the engine as it started across the bridge from Rainy River into Baudette. Then it came into view, pulling a long line of freight cars. Chug, 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 as it slowly came to a stop at the Baudette depot just west of their car. Directly in front of them, a closed-up boxcar. Now what, she hissed. You wait. Francois sprinted down the line, then ran back. An open car, he said. Empty. They will have it all to themselves. It was 2 cars down, but seemed like miles away as they carried first one, then the other of the men, and slid them into the boxcar and far back enough that they were out of sight. God help me, I feel sorry for the poor bastard, Sadie said. Especially Gus. He was all right. I brought blankets, Francois said. I'm not so heartless. They covered Gus and Cal, put the sack of plum cake beside them, and waited by the tracks. We make sure the train leaves, Francois said. After it did, they got back into the car and returned to Hotel Pascal, where Marie and Little Roy still played, and the dancers waltzed in 2 steps. The strangers had come, the strangers had gone. No one asked any questions or seemed to care. Thank you. I'd read more, but I'll leave you guys to read the book yourself. So I'm open for questions or comments or anything. Just don't be shy.
Is this the first of the trilogy?
No, the first in the trilogy is Hand Me Down My Walking King. And this wasn't supposed to be a trilogy. It was just going to be a sequel, Muskeg. But as I got into it and I realized that I'd gone into some of the secondary characters in the first book, I realized I was going to need a whole other book just to kind of wrap up all the characters. So there's a 3rd one coming. Stay tuned. Pardon me? I've started it, yes. Just barely, but I started.
Is there a title for the 3rd one?
I don't know yet. Yeah, I'm not sure. I wish I knew. It's always hard to pick a title. Muskeg was a little easier because a lot of it takes place out in the bog and, Muskeg, right? And I hope a lot of people that aren't from here have to look it up. They need to learn a new word. It's always hard to pick a title that kind of encompasses a book, so I'm not there yet, Sean, but I might call on you when time comes. Don't be shy, y'all. Yes?
I heard another Minnesota author talk about how starting a book, you have an idea, and you know where it's going to end up pretty much. but getting from point A to point B is what he called the swamp. Where all kinds of things can happen and changes can happen and you have to go back and forth and back and forth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I sure can. Who was the author, just out of curiosity, if you remember?
John Sanford.
John Sanford, yeah. And John Sanford, unlike me, writes suspense novels, and he's a great writer. You have to know your end when you're writing a suspense novel. So I didn't necessarily know how this book was going to end, nor did the first one. I mean, I got there, right? But the swamp in the middle, oh my God, yeah. I mean, you think, when I first heard novelists talking about this, they'd say, well, my characters, they just kind of let me know that they wouldn't do that. And I thought, oh, please, you know, what BS is that? You know, they're your characters, you can write, you can do what you want. But they kind of take on their own life, you know, and plus some of these characters I knew from the first book. And I would have these heated discussions with my husband, Leroy, who some of you know, and he'd say, they wouldn't do that. A man wouldn't talk like that. I said, oh, hey, it's my character. You don't get to tell me how they get to talk. He'd say, no, I'm telling you. Nobody will believe it. And so, yeah, that's part of the swamp, figuring out what's realistic, figuring out if it makes sense, if it'll make sense to people, if it's interesting, if you're repeating yourself too much. You know, who should be telling the story? John Sanford usually has one point of view, but I kind of like different people telling the story, so it's multiple point of view. Yeah, it's a lot of decisions, for sure. And I like that, the swamp, yeah, I would agree. Thank you. Yes, Jody. Thank you.
These are historically based. I mean, the facts are set in the history of time and place. But how much is that of your just knowing this place and time, or how much research do you do into the history of it?
Okay, well, that's a couple of really good questions. The first book, Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, was based on the relocation of people out in what we now call the wilderness area of Beltrami Island. It was a lot of little towns where people lived, and they didn't have a mayor, and they didn't have cops, and they lived on their own, and they liked it. And the relocation was infamous here in Baudette and in Lake of the Woods, and I heard about it all the time growing up. And so I based this first book definitely in the relocation. I made up my own characters, although there were some things like my stepdad, Terry Bixby, who some of you may remember, had been relocated out of Faunce with his family, and he told me about some of the things he'd seen. And Mary Dee Marhula told me these great stories about a relative who was a bootlegger. I borrowed some of their stories, but in general, I made up the characters, right? And just tried to keep fairly faithful to the story of the relocation. This was different. This one was very different because although people did hang out there, some of them, and they had to, Peach Dahl was just telling me about how somebody came out, and what my mom says, who knows, right? It's, you know, nobody knows anymore, but what she said is that at the very end, the superintendent of schools, I don't know who it was back then in the 30s, 37, 38, maybe even later, came out and basically threatened the families. And Peachy said that they were told that if the kids weren't in school the next year, they'd go to foster homes. And so the people with kids came out finally. And in my reimagining of it, this little Roy, the mute fiddler, and the Duprees, who are thinly disguised dolls, they're not big. I just mentioned, like I said, I wanted to honor them because they were so tough and so great. And Marie, who's a woman that lives out there and just likes to be left alone. She can sing, and she and little Roy sing and play together. This was definitely more like a novel, but in that I had to figure out Hazel's backstory, how she met Theda, how she got up to Oak Island, what happened then, this jealous husband coming after them, the detectives. But I did do a ton of research, and because I had to, because I wasn't alive then. I mean, I thought I was pretty well versed in the 1930s after having written the first book, and I'm really intrigued by that time period. I read everything I can find about it or set in that time period. However, there were a lot of things I didn't know. Like, there was a liberty, and I actually have a note about this in the acknowledgments in the bank. I took the liberty of keeping the CCC camp there in 1937, even though I had moved out 2 years before. But I like the idea of the CCC camp. I think plenty of our relatives worked in the CCC camps, and I just wanted to give them a little time in the sun. In fact, the resettlement administration had already come in, and they were doing a lot of what the CCC guys did. But that was one thing. Excuse me. Get some water here. The other thing I had to research was the treatment of gay and lesbian people back in the 20s and what happened. So I read a lot of books. One of the things I learned is that a lot of women would get married. They'd get married to somebody who was safe and would provide them kind of a cover, because I was really interested in what women did, because, you know, right, women, you know, we still don't have full equality in this society, right, ladies? And I mean, it's a lot better, right? But they had to go to some real extreme measures to hide themselves, whereas men, I don't know. I'm not a man, right? So I can't say. But women would often have these sham marriages in which they'd be fairly safe and, you know, they just keep living their lives. And otherwise, you know, there are terrible things that could happen. You could get put into a psychiatric hospital and spend the rest of your life there, you know, and worse, you know. So that's where I got the idea for this marriage with Hazel and Milt. And they remain close throughout the book. Thanks for that question. Yeah. Don't be shy, you guys. Peachy.
How long does it usually take you to write a book like this when you just started now? Or how long did it take for them?
Oh boy, that first one took me so long. It took me 10 years. I mean, and I will tell you, I was really perfectionist with it. I don't know how many drafts of it I did. I did it over and over and over and over and over again. And this one didn't take me that long, and I'm really hopeful the third one won't take me as long as this one. I'm getting older.
You probably got the hang of it.
Well, yeah, you got the hang of it. I got the characters better, but it's funny though. It's like, you know, you were talking about the swamp. Every book has its own little swamp, its own bog, if you will, you know. And this one took me 3 years to get, you know, to write the first draft, figure out who all the characters were, and then reorganize it so it made some sense. But yeah, it takes a while, I have to say.
Are you an avid reader?
I am. I read like crazy. When I was a little girl growing up in Baudette, and how many of you remember Mrs. Eng, the librarian, back from the old days? I can't, we have some old people here. Anyway, I would go up the stairs as a little girl, and I asked Mrs. Eng what was the limit of books we could take out of the library, and she said, I don't know if she had a limit, but she said, 13. And I said, okay. And so I'd come staggering out of there with 13 books. They were like Nancy Drew and I don't know what all, but you know, I read whatever they had in the library. My mom had books too, but I went through them pretty fast. So yeah, I read a lot. I love to read. And I do read nonfiction, largely about the 30s, because again, I'm kind of intrigued, real intrigued. But I do read a lot of novels, and I take ideas, and I'm interested in trilogies. Like Sarah Stonich, who actually blurred my book. She's a writer, and she's coming here in September. Yeah, she and Lorna Landvik, so that'll be fun. And they're going to be at the library. They're great. But she wrote a trilogy, also in a different place than the Northland, kind of over more in the Arrowhead. But yeah, I try to figure out how people are doing trilogies, like what do they say in this book and how they carry it through. And I tried really hard with this book to make sure it was a standalone book, that you wouldn't have had to read the first one to enjoy it. That it would probably enrich your experience of it because you'd know a lot more, but that you could read it by itself and it would be fine. So I hope it stands up that way. And I'll plan that for the third one as well. Ask some more questions, y'all.
Once the trilogy is done, then what?
You know, I've thought about that. I've actually thought, who knows, right? But I've been thinking about writing a memoir about growing up in Lake Withis County, so I can't seem to get away from here.
None of us can.
Yeah, none of us can, right? You know, we're from
That's
here.
why we're here.
So that's what I've thought of. I don't know yet, though, but I do feel, you know, as I get older, I just think, oh, I got all the time in the world to write these books, but now I know I don't, you know, so I gotta, get on it. Yeah. And I should, what?
Time goes fast.
Time goes fast. I should introduce you. This is Ella Carlson, who is one of my very dearest friends in the world, and she also is my publicist for the first book and for this one. She's and her marketing partner Kelly who designed this beautiful cover with photos by Håkan Carlson, who's Ella's husband, in the back there. These are her kids, Samira and Stefan. But she really made both books possible. I mean, like getting. I mean, she didn't write it, but in terms of getting it out in the world, she was here for the last one. You bet. I don't go anywhere without her. These books. Anyway, I wanted to tell you that because she's. Håkan took these pictures. There's actually a teeny tiny little bog down in the Twin Cities. Jody probably knows about it. Inside Theodore Wirth Park. It's like a little.
It's tiny.
Yeah, it's a little dull bog, but it's a bog. And so we went out there in May and we took pictures and we did a photo shoot, and all of the cover comes from that photo shoot that Håkan took, because he's amazing with a camera. And then Kelly did the rest. And I will tell you that these little lights that you see on it, they're my conception of bog witches, just so you know.
That's what I figured as soon as I saw it.
It's the bog witches. Some people think of bog witches. I mean, in Ireland, I think they're these old crones, and they're all wrinkled up and they've got a cane and a broom. But I think of them as kind of little fairies floating through the air with lights that, if they like you, and you get lost in the bog, they'll guide you out. If they don't like you, you're out of luck. Well, ask some more questions if you want.
What advice do you have to people who might have some idea in their head about writing something but don't think they're, and I'm not talking about me, but other people who might.
I think, well, first of all, I think there's a couple things. First of all, I think it's really important to write things down, because we all have these great ideas, but often they just fly out the door you're thinking about before you go to sleep, and then when you wake up, you think, what was that? And so, first of all, I think it's important to keep some kind of journal and just write down your ideas, no matter how silly you think they are. Maybe even keep in your car or dictate or something, so that they don't go away, for starters. And I do recommend, and then you just have to start writing. But I also recommend, because, maybe back in the old days, like with Dickens, they didn't take classes for writing because they just did it, right? But I think it's good to take a class. It's easy. There's lots of writing classes these days. Why? Because you learn things you don't know. You get accountability because you have to bring your stuff in. And it gives you like it gave me a little kick in the butt, And yeah, it's just good. So all those things. And share it with your friends, see if they have good ideas. But the main thing is to just sit your butt down and start writing it, because nobody's going to write it for you. You may think it's awful, but so what? It's your first draft. The first drafts are always awful. So don't worry about that. They really are. That's why they call them a first draft. Yes, in the back there.
When somebody does get a draft on it, how do they know what avenues to take to find somebody to help with their book or what's the next step?
Well, yeah, and the next step's not promoting usually, but yeah, that's a really good question. I'm lucky enough to have a couple writing groups that I'm in. One that's been going since the early 90s, another one that came out of that novel writing class I told you about. And they're women I trust. They're not all women, novel groups mixed, but I trust them all, and I give it to them. I'll give them the first draft, and usually tell them just see what makes sense to you. If there's something that kind of clangs, tell me about that. Or if there's something that's really working, tell me about that. And then you get all that stuff back and you think about it. And you don't have to take it as gospel truth, right? I mean, I think it's kind of like the 12-step program. You take what you like and leave the rest, right? But it gives you a start. With my first book, I actually had Mary Loke, who's another Minnesota writer, read through it, because I was very insecure about it. And so she gave it a read. I paid her to read through it and, just tell me her thoughts, not to copy edit it, but, so yeah, and then you'll probably go back and do a second draft, and you always learn a lot when you do the second draft, when you revise it. I mean, you see things you didn't see before, and you realize things. So, I mean, I think you can't do that until you've written that messy first draft. Annie Lamott, who's a writer, and some of you may have read, she wrote a great book called Bird by Bird, which is, I recommend, it's about writing things. And she said, okay, should I say the S word here in front of everybody? Okay, so she said, what she says,